France abolishes monarchy and becomes a republic. Abolishes means to stop, to put an end to the monarchy, the rule of one single king or queen or an emperor. The situation in France continued to be tense during the following years. Although Louis XVI had signed the constitution, he entered into secret negotiations with the King of Prussia. What are negotiations? Negotiations are secret discussions. Louis XVI signed the constitution, accepted the demands of the third estate, but he had negotiations with the King of Prussia. Rulers of other countries too were worried by the developments in France and made plans to send troops to put down the events that had been taking place there since the summer of 1789. Even other countries were interested in what was happening in France. Before this could happen, the National Assembly voted in April 1792 to declare war against Prussia and Austria. Thousands of volunteers thronged from the provinces to join the army. Volunteers means people on their own were ready to take part in the war, in the army, and they came in crowds. Throng means they came into crowds from their own provinces, from their own regions to join the army. They saw this as a war of the people against kings and aristocracies all over Europe. For these volunteers, it was a war between common people and the kings and aristocracies. Aristocracies are high-class people. Among the patriotic songs they sang was the Marseillaise, composed by the poet Roger de Lille. It was sung for the first time by volunteers from Marseilles as they marched into Paris and so got its name. The Marseillaise is now the national anthem of France. So this is about the national anthem of France. Now Marseillaise is the national anthem of France and it was sung for the first time by the volunteers as they marched from Paris. The Revolutionary Wars brought losses and economic difficulties to the people. Whenever there are wars, there are expenditures and it is very difficult for the common people. While the men were away fighting at the front, women were left to cope with the tasks of earning a living and looking after their families. When the men were fighting, they had their own families, women and children, and now women had the responsibility to earn a living and look after the families. Large sections of the population were convinced that the revolution had to be carried further, as the Constitution of 1791 gave political rights only to the richer sections of society. Now, Constitution of 1791 gave political rights only to the richer sections of society. Common men were not allowed to participate in politics. So because of this, to get the rights, large section of the population wanted the revolution to be carried further. But revolution is a process of change. Whatever change was taking place in France, it should be taken ahead. Political clubs became an important rallying point for people who wished to discuss government policies and plan their own forms of actions. Now, political clubs were formed by the people and they were important places, important points for people, and people used to sit and discuss and make plans. The most successful of these clubs was that of the Jacobins, which got its name from the former convent of Saint Jacob in Paris. Women too, who had been active throughout this period, formed their own clubs. Section 4 of this chapter will tell you more about their activities and demands. The members of the Jacobin club belonged mainly to the less prosperous sections of society, means the third estate or the poor people. They included small shopkeepers, artisans such as shoemakers, pastry cooks, watchmakers, printers, as well as servants and daily wage workers. Their leader was Maximilien Robespierre. A large group among the Jacobins decided to start wearing long striped trousers similar to those worn by dock workers. Now they made a dress code of their own. They decided to wear long striped trousers like those worn by the dock workers. This was to set themselves apart from the fashionable sections of society, especially nobles who wore knee breeches. Now, knee breeches were worn by the nobles. Knee breeches are short pants that are just a little below the knees. These knee breeches, these short pants were worn by the nobles. And what was the dress code of the Jacobins? Long striped trousers. It was a way of proclaiming the end of the power wielded by the wearers of knee breeches. These Jacobins came to be known as the sans-culottes. What is meant by sans-culottes? Sans-culottes are people of the lower classes. These Jacobins, they were now came to be known as sans-culottes, literally meaning those without knee breeches. Sans-culottes men wore in addition the red cap that symbolized liberty. Women, however, were not allowed to do so. In the summer of 1792, the Jacobins planned an insurrection of a large number of Parisians who were angered by the short supplies and high prices of food. Now, what is insurrection? Insurrection is violent attempt to take control. Okay. Now, they were agitated, they were angry, and now they planned for an insurrection of large number of Parisians. The Jacobins had a plan, who were angered by the short supplies and high prices of food. Now they wanted to insurrect, means they wanted to take control of Parisians. On the morning of August 10, they stormed the palace of the Tuileries, massacred the king's guards, and held the king himself as hostage for several hours. They massacred the king's guards, they killed the guards, and they held the king himself as hostage for several hours. What is meant by hostage? The king was held. He was held in such a way that he can be a security for the fulfillment of the conditions of the Jacobins. Means he was held, and they were able to pressurize to fulfill their conditions. Later the assembly voted to imprison the royal family. Now the assembly voted, and actually they were ready to imprison the royal family. Elections were held. From now on, all men of 21 years and above, regardless of wealth, got the right to vote. The newly elected assembly was called the Convention. On 21 September 1792, it abolished the monarchy and declared France a republic. Now, what was the changes in the voting rights? Earlier, men about 21 years were allowed to vote, but that too they should pay the taxes equal to 3 days of their wages. But now here, even regardless of the wealth, they could have the right to vote. As you know, a republic is a form of government where the people elect the government, including the head of the government. There is no hereditary monarchy. Now, as we know, republic form of government was declared on 21st September 1792, and now republic means there was no monarchy, there was no hereditary monarchy. People were able to now elect the government, including the head of the government. Louis XVI was sentenced to death by a court on the charge of treason. Treason is the crime of betraying one's country, the crime of putting one's own country into danger. Now, Louis XVI was sentenced to death. What was his crime? His crime was that he has put his country in danger. On 21st January 1793. He was executed publicly at the Place de la Concorde. The Queen Marie Antoinette met with the same fate shortly after. He was executed, he was killed, he was sentenced to death publicly in front of all the people, and the same punishment was given to the Queen Marie Antoinette. The Reign of Terror. The period from 1793 to 1794 is referred to as the Reign of Terror. Robespierre followed a policy of severe control and punishment. All those whom he saw as being enemies of the Republic, ex-nobles and clergy, members of other political parties, even members of his own party who did not agree with his methods, were arrested, imprisoned, and then tried by a revolutionary tribunal. Now, who was Robespierre? He was the leader of the Jacobin Club. He followed a policy of severe control and punishment during the period 1793 to 1794. All those who went against the Republic, like the ex-nobles, the clergy, the members of the political parties, and even members of his own party who did not agree with his methods, were arrested, imprisoned, and then tried by a revolutionary tribunal. Tribunal means a case was filed against that person. If the court found them guilty, they were guillotined. Guillotine is a method of killing a person, a punishment. A guillotine is a device consisting of two poles and a blade with which a person is beheaded. It was named after Dr. Guillotine, who invented it. Robespierre's government issued laws placing a maximum ceiling on wages and prices. Robespierre's government issued laws placing a maximum ceiling on wages and prices. Ceiling means the highest limit at which goods or services can be sold. Like Robespierre's government made arrangement for maximum ceiling so that a good amount of profit can be earned on selling goods and services. Meat and bread were rationed. Ration means they were given at low prices. At ration shops, peasants were forced to transport their grain to the cities and sell it at fixed prices by the government. The prices that were fixed by the government. The use of more expensive white flour was forbidden. All citizens were required to eat the pain equality bread, a loaf made of whole meat. Equality was also sought to be practiced through forms of speech and address. Instead of the traditional Monsieur and Madame, all French men and women were henceforth citoyen and citoyenne. Churches were shut down and their buildings converted into barracks or offices. Now, churches were also shut down and they were converted into the building were used for offices. So all these things were changed by Robespierre government. Peasants were forced to sell grains at the prices fixed by the government. Nobody could cheat. And also bread and meat were rationed, sold at lower prices, and the sir and madam, all these traditional posts, traditional respect giving positions were removed. Robespierre pursued his policies so relentlessly that even his supporters began to demand moderation. Finally, he was convicted by a court in July 1794, arrested, and on the next day sent to guillotine. He did such a great work, but finally he was convicted by a court, arrested, and on the next day he was also guillotined. So the period between 1793 to 1794 is called the Reign of Terror. A directory rules France. The fall of the Jacobin government allowed the wealthier middle classes to seize power. A new constitution was introduced which denied the vote to non-propertized sections of society. Now, as Robespierre government was not in force now, who came up? The wealthier middle classes now seized the power, took the power. A new constitution was introduced. Now, this new constitution refused the vote to non-propertized poor sections of society. It provided for 2 elected legislative councils. These then appointed a directory and executive made up of 5 members. The directory included 5 members. This was meant as a safeguard against the concentration of power in a one-man executive as under the Jacobins. However, the directors often clashed with the legislative councils, who then sought to dismiss them. The political instability of the directory paved the way for the rise of a military dictator, Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, this political instability of the directory, of the 5 executive, they were sometimes having clashes. This condition of clashes paved the way, made a way for the rise of a military dictator. Now, because of this failure of directory, who came up? The military dictator Napoleon Bonaparte. Through all these changes in the form of government, the ideals of freedom, of equality before the law, and of fraternity remained inspiring ideals that motivated political movements in France and the rest of Europe during the following century. Now, though the government went from one hand to other, people kept on understanding the ideals of freedom, of equality before the law, and of fraternity. These inspiring ideals kept on motivating political movements in France and the rest of Europe during the following century.